Ladies and gentlemen, we have finally made it towards the end. We're going to do some slight scheduling changes with this, so we're going to start off with this film review, and then after this we're going to do Deadpool 1 and 2. I'll obviously review Deadpool 3, and then I'll push New Mutants back after Deadpool 3, and once the New Mutants video comes out, I'll also put my rankings for all the X-Men movies combined. But for now, let's get into probably the most emotional and probably favorite review I will ever do in my lifetime. Logan, directed by James Mangold, was supposed to be the final ride for Hugh Jackman as this character. The film takes inspiration from the comics of the Old Man Logan story, and in this one he's seen taking care of Charles Xavier, but in doing so he finds new mutants that he must protect, and one that he finds a deeper personal connection to. I feel like I've said this at least one time so far, but if I haven't, I will let everybody know that this is my favorite movie of all time. So let's just get that out of the way first. Like, there are things in this movie that I will probably try to criticize, but to me, these are going to be things that I gloss over because I have just such an affinity for this movie and a deep personal connection to this character, no less, and more importantly, Hugh Jackman portraying this character, that I kind of just like watch this movie and really engulf myself into the storyline. And the cast is relatively small in this movie too, so you get a lot of time with a lot of these characters to really build up the bond and the tragic ending to one of the most beloved characters for the last almost 20 years at that point. So Logan had kind of a weird history as far as its movies go, because obviously you had, X-Men Origins, not really bloody or anything like that. It's PG-13. It's not a very good movie. You jump to The Wolverine, which is directed by James Mangold as well, and it takes that PG-13 rating and it really tries to drive home a little bit more of that violence and sort of aggressive tone that we all know that Wolverine loves to use. But there was always that one itching feeling that all the fans wanted from a Logan movie, and is to go full rated R. Let him cuss a storm, let him completely slice and dice people and see him completely hack everybody up. And when this film was revealed to be rated R, man, does the first opening scene deliver it in every way possible. The film takes place in 2029 after the events of Days of Future Past. We see Logan sleeping in a car and realize that he's basically a taxi driver at this point in his life. He's rugged, he's beat up, he's old, he's withering away, and he has to take care of a bunch of guys that are trying to steal some parts off of his car. He tries to reason with them at first, but then Logan is shot in the chest, and these people do not know what they are dealing with, because then Logan gets up, he retracts his claws, although one of them doesn't really come out all the way. So you start to see how this character, just not even just in the physical, features of his body, like just with like his skin and like all the sores that he has on him, now you get to see like his claws are not even working as well as they used to. He's trying really hard not for them to mess up the car, because clearly he doesn't want anything damaged to this so he can continue doing the taxi driving stuff. But they get him into a berserker mode. He completely goes off the rails, and the slicing and dicing in this scene is insane, really. Cutting off a dude's hand, stabbing a dude from his chin up where you see the claw marks coming out from his forehead basically, and then you see him like basically stab a dude left, right, and center up his gut. It's again this euphoric feeling you get when watching this movie, at least I do every time, but definitely for the first time you get to see this and you just go, this is what I wanted, this is exactly what I needed. So we see Logan go into the bathroom, and this is yet another callback to one of the many scenes that they have throughout the entire time for Logan. We see him more specifically in X-Men Origins when he's first looking at his claws that look like shit, remember. We also then get a similar scene like in The Wolverine, where we see Logan looking at his body where it's not healing correctly, although he's in his prime, so it's much more of a confusing state. This scene is very much an old man on his last legs, looking at himself and just looking at the wear and tear that's gone through his body, and just basically looking at how his life has turned to this point. So as we see him driving people around, we get little hints of things about his life at this point. He's using his full name. He has a driver's license right there where it says James Howlett. It's 2029 as stated earlier, and it's supposedly New Mutants haven't been in the population for many years at this point. While mutants are basically a thing of the past, Logan is somehow starting to get wrapped up into some sort of storyline that he doesn't really want to be a part of. There's a lady that's trying to ask for him, saying that you're the Wolverine, I found you, I need your help for anything. He's basically telling her to fuck off and go away from me, I don't want to deal with you. And this is during a funeral of some sort, because we see him taking somebody away and them asking him what is that girl's problem, and he's like, I have no idea, don't worry about it. And this is the first glance we get of the girl who Daphne Keane plays in this film beautifully, Laura. But after this is done, we end up getting an introduction to one of the couple of villains that they have throughout this story. We see Boyd Holbrook, who plays Donald Pierce in this story. He's basically a guy that has a robotic hand and kind of gets in Logan's car and tells him that he's looking for a Mexican girl that may or may not have seen him, and he sees how Logan is like a different man than when he was thought of, because there's this really great part in the car scene right here where he sits in his car, he looks at Logan, and he goes, as I live and breathe, the Wolverine. Because again, mutants aren't around anymore, really. The X-Men have been disbanded. Like, there's no need for mutants to be around, and clearly they're not as populated as they once were. So hearing him kind of talk about the lore of the X-Men in front of him and basically like being all savvy with his words and pandering to him is really nice to see. I'll get the slight negative out of the way first here though with this though too, is that the characterization for the villains in this story is a little weak. You have Donald Pierce in this movie, who definitely has a charismatic presence, and he's around for the vast majority of the movie as the antagonist. But then you also get a doctor here who's played by Richard B. Grant. He's technically like the head honcho of all this thing. Pierce technically goes to him and does his bidding, but, you know, Donald is kind of like the ever-presence around most of the scenes. So again, the characterization for the two of them isn't amazing. I definitely like Pierce way more in this because of just the accent and the way he looks, obviously, and he's just around way more for it to be a charismatic presence more than when the doctor shows up. But we then cut to Logan going back to his home where he lives with Caliban now. We had a small interaction with Caliban in X-Men Apocalypse. He is a mutant that can track people, and he's living with him now, and both of them take care of Charles Xavier. Charles Xavier is old, like mega old in this movie. He is so old, he has a degenerative disease for his brain. It's a really sad moment in this movie because you see Logan kind of getting drugs from a guy from a hospital here, and then you see him going home, and Caliban's like, it's your turn to take care of him, I had a rough night, this isn't enough medicine for him. And it's all building up to this moment to where Charles is living in this empty water tower, basically, where it's supposed to be a shield basically for his power so he doesn't hurt people. And it's such a sad moment in this story because we know Charles Xavier as a man who is well-spoken and can stick up for himself and can think for himself. And then once we see him for the first time in this movie, he's an old man in a wheelchair who's gone a little senile. He's repeating advertisements from a radio, and he's bumping into Logan and not remembering what his name is. It's really heartbreaking, honestly. You also get a taste of what Charles is going through as well, outside of just not remembering things, to when he falls on the ground, his powers kind of kick in and he has a small seizure, and this makes Logan kind of fall back a little bit from his powers, but then you also see Caliban kind of, you know, holding a knife as he's cutting up vegetables, and he's kind of frozen in place. And the banter back and forth between Charles Xavier and Logan is going to be great throughout this entire movie, but this is the first time where we really get to see them kind of talking with each other like in meaningful conversation. Logan enters the building the first time and he doesn't know who he is. He's kind of saying, who are you? But then once he gets the medicine and he's put in bed, Charles is like, I always know who you are, sometimes I just can't recognize your face. Which is just like, oh, like, man, I rewatched this movie tonight, and I knew there were certain parts of this movie that I was going to get emotional by, obviously, because I've seen this at least a couple of times. But rewatching that part, and then, like, you know, if you've ever lived with somebody that's had Alzheimer's disease, it's definitely a new perspective that you see. Like, I watch this movie and I look at that and I just go, oh, that's probably something that's been said by somebody before. And you just have a weird attachment to it. And plus, again, I love these characters and these actors as these, you know, portrayal of Wolverine and, you know, Charles. So it's like hearing that from him just hurts, you know? They're starting to talk to each other basically about their lives. There hasn't been a New Mutant born in 25 years apparently here, and Logan's just basically telling Charles that he just needs to go to sleep and he needs to stay calm. He can't use his powers until he locks him back in there. And Charles lets out this big wail at the end where he's like, "You're just waiting for me to die." I will say also, I do love the role reversal here between Logan and Charles, where Charles is clearly the father figure and the one mentor and taking care of Wolverine and helping him in his life early on. But now we get to this movie many years later where Charles is clearly not capable of doing much on his own, and then Logan has to come in and basically take care of the man that once taught him all that he knows. There's another beautiful scene that happens right after this where we see Wolverine basically take the claw that was jammed in his one hand and start to pull it out, and you see all this blood dripping out and everything. It's so weird because I almost want to say it's beautiful, but it's also like, you know, it's hard to watch because it's an old man who, you know, at this point in his stage, he doesn't heal normally at this. Clearly, you could tell at this point. So, like, he has to do certain things to his body just to kind of make it semi-functional. Like, he's wrapping his hand because he cut his hand from pulling the claw out. That would never happen before in his prime. But this is where the rest of the story kind of gets jump started a little bit here. We see Logan end up meeting the same Spanish woman from earlier, and he's trying to not deal with her and trying to leave from the premises, but she eventually persuades him to take the girl to Canada, and she'll have a ton of money for him because Logan's goal right now is to be able to buy a boat so that he could take Charles on it, and so they could just live the rest of their lives on the ocean on a boat. So Logan reluctantly agrees to this. He goes back to Charles, tells him that he'll be back in a couple of days. Once he returns back to the apartment, though, the woman that had been taking care of this little girl is now dead. Logan returns back to his home. Obviously something's wrong. He's trying to gather his thoughts and trying to figure out what to do next. But Caliban ends up seeing a bag and some other things in his car that are definitely not Logan's. I will say this too before we get any further, just so I can give him his flowers as well. Stephen Merchant plays Caliban in this story, and he is awesome in this movie. He plays a very serious role. He's supposed to be like a comedic actor, and he also directed Fighting With My Family, which was a wrestler's kind of, you know, biopic sort of. So he has his hands in like a lot of different things, but this is definitely the role that I see and I go, oh, okay, he's a really talented actor with some decent range here. Pierce ends up showing up to Logan's camp, but is knocked out by the girl. The girl has now ended up onto his home, and Charles comes out and says, this is the girl that I'd been speaking to all this time, because he had been taking his medicine, so he's still able to use his powers, and this is now the first mutant he's been able to talk to outside of Caliban and Logan for many years at this point. This sets up the next action sequence in this movie, really the big major one in this story, where we see Laura having the same powers as Wolverine. And she's such a badass too, because Daphne Keane played this role so well. I think she was like 12 maybe when this movie was being in production, so she had a lot on her plate because she doesn't speak for the majority of the movie, and a lot of her stuff is like through facial features and body language and stuff like that. And like there's moments in this movie where she acts like a little feral like animal. So we see her be a complete badass at one point where she walks out of the building where all of Pierce's guards are waiting for her, and she takes one of the heads of the guards that was going to capture her and just throws it at the feet of him. And it's just like, if you didn't think she was a badass before, this is definitely the moment where she shows it. She has 2 claws coming from her hand rather than the 3 that Wolverine does, and she just wrecks shop. There's some great shots here too that I also love, because there's a little bit of a zoom in on her face where she's like turned the corner, almost like how Logan would be doing, similar to the X2 mansion scene where he kind of waits around the hallway corner for somebody to turn around. She's so quick, fast, and fluid, and really aggressive with it. There's so much blood and gore in this. So many people's like hands get cut off and decapitated and legs are torn off. It's just so amazing. But then you also see Laura have another set of claws. She has one spike that comes out of her foot as well, which is elegantly explained by Charles later on in the movie, where females in like a herd of lions are much more of the hunters and providers more often than not than the males. and they tend to use the back legs more as a defense rather than the front claws are more of like an attack mechanism, which shows here because she's trying to use the foot claw to kind of help her like not be dragged away from some of these guards. And there's just so many awesome kills. Like I could honestly gush about this movie for hours on end, so I'm like really trying hard to kind of reel it in a little bit to not go forever on this movie. The three of them end up driving away from everybody, and this is where we get kind of like a road trip kind of movie at this point. This is the part I also see where people tend to be like, the tone shifts and they don't really like it too much, and they think that, you know, not much happens at this point in the story. But I disagree, because this really brings home the characterization for everybody, and the chemistry is brought together way more between everyone. We see scenes where they go to the gas station, and then, you know, you see Logan helping Charles go to the bathroom. Laura's in the store and she's just opening stuff and eating it, and then she almost kills the store guard, but then Logan has to say this amazing line.
Come on, that's enough. These two.
Not okay.
Again, Logan's trying to teach her like how to be like a better person, like not be like stupid and do these certain things. But then also at the end of this scene, he ends up grabbing a couple of cheap cigars on his way out. This is where we get a little bit more of the exposition dump for some of the movie too. They're on a road trip basically to get to North Dakota, to get to Canada, so that Laura can be safe and be wherever that the girl was telling her to go to in the first place. But she leaves back a phone with all this information about how she was a nurse at this lab and they were experimenting on kids and making them into mutant weapons, much like how Logan was back in the day. Now, I don't remember if I had mentioned it in Apocalypse, but I'll mention it here again just to be, you know, a little bit more transparent with it. So supposedly, through some of the research I was looking at, the Exis Corp was supposed to be the main villain in this story, which it still technically is for sure, but Mr. Sinister was supposed to be somewhat of a figural appearance in this movie because he runs it supposedly. However, when they realized this was supposed to be Hugh Jackman's like swan song and riding off in the sunset as his character, they decided to kind of tuck that part of the story away, but still keep the experimental mutant part of this story here. So you see videos of a bunch of kids being experimented on, Laura specifically. Obviously you see the surgery of the claws being put into her hands and to her feet. It's just brutal stuff to watch. It is really uncomfortable watching it. It's really takes it back to like how Wolverine's flashbacks in like the X-Men movies, especially like X2, where you get to see like the blood on his hands and like he's just tortured the whole time. They really understood how to get that part of the tone for that movie correct. And speaking of tone, they really do not hold back on the Western front of this movie. So much so that when they're in the hotel room, Charles and Laura are watching a movie on the TV, and it's an old Western called Shane. Shane's story is basically an old gunslinger that's supposed to have one last rodeo, and it's very much the inspiration for this movie. James Mangold has even said it himself in interviews and commentary tracks and stuff like that, that it was definitely a huge inspiration for this movie, and it just shows you right here. But what's something here that most movies don't really do too often, and I feel like it was one of the first few that did it, was it acknowledges that comic books of characters exist in this universe. Logan ends up finding out that Laura's been reading a bunch of these comics that she's kept about the X-Men, and he basically shows into her and being like, this is all bullshit. Like, these are all like a quarter of the things are actually true in this. Everything else is just made up by people just to make a quick buck, really. And he becomes even more disgruntled with this because as he's getting a new car for them to travel even further down the line, he finds out that Eden is the place that they are going, and it's the same coordinates that he was given to go to. So they're basically chasing this random dream that was in a comic book that this nurse told her to go to. But once he goes back to his hotel, he realizes that the people that were chasing after him are now there and they're trying to look for him, but Charles has another episode. This leads to another really intense and really gory and graphic scene here where you see Logan stabbing all these guys in the face, trying to save Charles and make sure that he gets the medicine so he releases everybody, because now he's not just affecting him and Laura, he's affecting like everybody in this hotel vicinity. And one of the parts too that I didn't think was going to get me emotional at one point in this movie is once Charles gets his medicine and they start to leave the hotel, as he's being rolled out of the casino, he's whispering to everybody, being like, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to, I'm so sorry, which is just, again, really, really heartbreaking for this character. And the tear-jerking doesn't really stop here because, you know, I'm just a fucking emotional mess watching this movie. I literally just finished it like maybe an hour ago, and I'm still thinking about all of this. But the subsequent scenes after this is some of my favorite stuff in this little road trip sequence that they do here. So all three of them are driving, and they're arguing about Eden, and they're arguing about where to go next, when all of a sudden somebody is thrown off the road, and some horses end up getting out of a stable from this truck that they were following. So Charles convinces Logan to kind of help him go gather the horses and bring them back to the truck, and we see Charles be able to use his power one more time for good, and you get to see him close his eyes as he sits in the truck, and he uses it as the horses tend to, behave a little bit more because it's a highway, and the horses start to walk back and trot back, and he's just smiling at the end of it. Again, it's really beautiful, and I do love this part of the movie because it gives this character that has a lot of trauma right here one more good deed basically for him, which then leads to all of them ending up going to dinner as like basically a token of their gratitude. And you get this really awesome dinner scene with all of them. You see Logan and you see Charles kind of talking with one another, and they're chatting it up like old buddies, and it's beautiful to see, really. And what makes it even worse too is that we see Logan go off with the husband of the house to fix some issue with the water gauge, but we go back to the house and we see Charles is sleeping and Laura is sleeping on the floor in the guest bedroom, and Charles is basically saying that like, this was a great time, this is one of the best nights I've had in a long time. And then he starts telling him like, I don't deserve it because I've done terrible things. And he's self-hating himself right here, this old man that knows that he's basically on his last legs, and the things that he's done in his life that have been good are now being taken away by the things that he's now doing bad. And once she turns over as he thinks he's talking to Logan, he gets stabbed in the chest by Logan, or at least a clone of Logan. It's X-24 that was kind of hinted at earlier in some of the graphic labs that they had seen. It's even more sad too because if you remember earlier in the movie, he basically says that he always knows who he is, he just doesn't recognize his face. So when he sees Logan and recognizes that it's a Logan stabbing him, partially because it's a younger version of him, it's just devastating to think about. X-24 is running rampant through the house. He kills the family that's there. There's an awesome shot where the prime X-24, the weapon that they really wanted Wolverine to be, is kind of panning around old man Logan, and he's kind of distraught by the whole situation that's happening. This leads to one of the major fights in this movie. We see Logan at first grabbing Charles and putting him in the back of the truck, constantly telling himself over and over and over again, it wasn't me, it wasn't me. Once Charles is put down in the truck, he kind of whispers to himself the Sunseeker, because that's the name of the boat that they wanted to get. He turns around and sees X-24, and he just goes to town on him, really. But again, X-24 is a prime version of what Wolverine was. It's an artificially made, weapon at this point. So he clearly gets his shit rocked for the vast majority of this fight. He's saved by the husband, who is, able to push him aside into some spikes, so it basically ends this fight. But now we get to see Laura and Logan basically on their own for the rest of the movie. But to touch on the fight a little bit more too, is that this is the first time you get to see Wolverine outside of X-Men 1 and X2 with Lady Deathstrike. This is the first time you get to see a really, really intense battle between a mutant of his caliber. The blood is just going everywhere. You hear the claw marks and the whipping of the hands. Like, it is a legit awesome bloody mess of a fight, and it's great. This then leads to them leaving the farm, where Logan ends up burying Charles, and it's just another sad scene for Logan, because even to this moment he still doesn't want to show emotion, because you hear him under his breath as he's now buried the only member really left of his family that he knows for sure, and he just tells him that it's got water, because he keeps talking about how they were supposed to go on this boat and they're supposed to live on the boat, but at least Charles is going to be by a body of water now. I will say they try to betray the tone a little bit here, unfortunately, where they have Logan try to start up the car, and he kind of has like an angry meltdown where he's like bashing the car with his shovel and everything. And it's like, it's kind of funny, but then it's also like you're seeing this be like the sort of breaking point for him as well. As he passes out, Laura was actually able to take him to a local hospital where he's patched up ever so slightly. You get to see some really gnarly claw marks around his chest and everywhere where all the scars are on his body now. And the doctor's basically trying to tell him, like, there's something poisoning you, there's something wrong with you. And what was actually wrong with him the whole time is the adamantium was poisoning him ever since it was infused in his body. But because the X gene is just that, it's like a mutant gene, it's a cell in your body. And with them kind of withering away over time, the healing factor was just not keeping up with healing this metal poisoning in his body. So it was eventually just eating away and eating away for many, many years. But then they get a really funny scene here that's pretty earned, I would say, because you get Laura and Logan in the car, and Logan's basically saying that, I don't know how you got me here, but I just want to say I appreciate you for doing that. And she says, you're welcome, in Spanish. To which he's like, you could talk? What the fuck was all this bullshit for however many miles? And they get into this really intense argument. This scene is amazing too, because you get to see the chemistry between these people intensely here. They have an intense conversation. They're like, shouting at each other. There's an audition tape that was, shown around on the internet where it showed Daphne Keane playing with Hugh Jackman in a casting role, trying to figure out who was obviously going to play this character, and she won it, and they said that she blew it out the water for the audition. And you can really tell that it's great too, because there's a portion in this little fight that they have that I love, that I don't know why it got me the second time around watching this, but as I was watching it, she punches him in the arm because he keeps telling him, like, I'm not going to take you there because it's fake. It's all comic stuff. And it is a really hard drive. It's, an extra 2-day drive, and it's going to kill me, basically. She starts punching him in the arm hard as fuck, and he just goes, don't hit me. And you see it in the eye where he's just like, I am not to be fucked with right now. I've lost everything, and this is the last thing I need to deal with. He eventually gets his wits, and then he wants to prove to her that this place is not real, so he ends up taking her to find Eden. As this happens, Logan and Laura end up finding the kids that escaped the experiment room, and now they are all camping out at this warehouse thing where they are now going to eventually jump the border and go to Canada to be rid of all of the mutant torment that they have had for years. There's some great scenes here with some of the kids. There's, Laura and Logan already have some really good dialogue, but the one that I really want to focus on before I get to that is a deleted scene that they had actually had for this film. There was a scene where you had Logan talking to one of the kids who had action figures of him and Sabretooth. And he was saying, yes, there is portions of things that are real. Me and him were in the same program that tormented us, and, we were at, each other's heads for years on later. Talking about how he always did bad things with him, but the kid just tells him, but now you do good things, right? And Logan finishes off the conversation with, kid, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know why they deleted this scene. It's actually a really good scene in my opinion. But the stuff that gets me here is the stuff where he talks with Laura. He has a conversation with her. He has a bad dream. They have a little bit of discussion about themselves being tormented by people and how they kill people and how, it's something that they have to deal with forever. She ends up telling him that she found a bullet in his pocket, which is made of adamantium. And at first it's kind of played for laughs where he's saying, I was actually thinking about shooting myself with it. But upon rewatch, it is like really sad, because it's just like, man, this guy was plotting out the suicide the whole time for him to, he was going to wait for Charles to go on this boat, and then it was just going to be poof, that's it. That's his life. They have a conversation a day or so later after the kids have kind of messed with his beard and made him look like the young Wolverine again, where he has this whole portion of his beard kind of shaved down a little bit lighter. But they have another intense conversation where Laura is almost brushing him off, but he's like, I got you here. I gave you the money back. You should be thankful for it. And he's like, basically lets out all the emotions that he doesn't really let anybody see. He tells her that he's not very good at this. He says that he's really bad at doing these things because bad shit happens to people I care about. To which she says back to him saying, then I'll be fine, which is just like, oh man, you guys have such a complicated relationship right now. This father-daughter thing is really weird for them. They just never really seem to get on page for the majority of the time up until the end of the movie, really. But this is where you get the final act of the movie. You see the kids have already left to try and cross the border to Canada to where they can outrun all these lab people, but they ended up finding them, and Logan now has to make one last heroic stance to help these kids. And the intense chills that I get watching this scene is insane, because there's a couple of scenes here where you see the kids do a couple of things where they kill some of the guards there, and some of them are pretty cool to see. There's a girl that like controls like nature and like has like all these spikes hit somebody and like the dude explodes. But there's a part in this movie where you see Logan take the serum that they were giving him that like basically enhances mutant abilities for a short period of time, and you get to see the rage, the berserker rage, like the youth had just come back to him, and he's like running through the forest and he chops all these things up, and you see the real good shot of him where he hits somebody and you feel the power of him punching somebody down a hill, and the camera shakes till then he lunges at somebody where he rips the claws out of him and he just lets out this primal scream that was just like, oh, it's so good. This leads to the last little info dump of the movie where Pierce is there, and now Dr. Rice is there, and he is apparently the son of William Stryker because he's telling him that you know my father from the experiments that he'd done to you. He's kind of just blown to the wayside. He gets shot in the neck and he's killed, rather quickly. He's a very non-consequential character in this movie. He's not really there for much. However, Pierce actually has a better ending in the sense of the kids all gang up on him and torture him and like use all their powers to like basically kill him. He's like wrapped up in grass and like snapped in like 10 different ways basically. But then you see X-24 come out of his cage, and now there is the final battle between Logan and X-24. And it's just as bloody as all of them. It's just as intense as the rest of them. Laura tries to help. A couple of the other kids try to help. But in the end, X-24 ends up overpowering Logan to such an extent. The last little bit of the fight has X-24 basically drag him by the shoulder and plant him through a tree trunk. Now, he is kind of killed off rather quickly and, kind of pushed to the wayside slightly, because you see Laura take the same bullet that would have been used for Wolverine and just shoot X-24's head half off. So it is kind of like, if you're nitpicking it a little bit, this is one of the things that most people wouldn't like, but she ends up killing X-24 in an attempt to try to save Logan. This is where you get the end of the movie, and this is the emotional, like, everything swells at this point in the movie with the music and the pain that you see in him, and obviously, physically shown, like he's just sitting there with this spike through his chest. And there was a scene in The Wolverine where Yukio had said that you die laying on a bed with blood on your hands and holding your heart in one of your hands. And it's interpreted in a lot of different ways, but some people think that, it is fitting that his heart would be like his own flesh and blood, like because Daphne Keene as X-23 is a clone of his. So he is basically sitting there, bruised and battered, saved the kids, but at the cost of his life. The things that killed me here a little bit too with some of the emotional stuff is obviously you're seeing, one of your favorite characters, start to die in this movie. But the thing that caught me when I watched it again recently was I didn't remember when Laura looks at him and she like mutters the word daddy. And for whatever reason, like that just like killed me. Like I was just like, no, like that can't be it. Like, no. He tells her that she'll be safe and that she'll, be okay with them and that everything should be done, and don't forget what they made you. And the one line that always hurts to listen to is when he starts to smile a little bit and he just goes, so this is what it feels like. And then he dies. The kids then bury him. Laura ends up making a speech, the same speech that was in the Shane movie. And as they walk away, Laura forgets to do one thing. She turns around, she takes the cross that was made for his gravestone and turns it on its side, so now it's an X. The movie is beautiful. I really don't know what else to say. I've told everyone the complaints that you may have in this movie, but I just don't care, man. I love Hugh Jackman as Wolverine. I loved his portrayal for many, many years. I remember watching this movie day one when it came out with my brother. I was sobbing watching this movie. Like, it's the ugliest cry I've ever done in my life, honestly. Because he really meant something to me in that moment. Like, this was a guy that had played this character all my childhood. He's the one of the few only characters to have been played by one guy. One guy through all the bad and the good. Like, he gets to go off on his high horse, and they send him off in this beautiful way. And at the end of it, I had wrote on here, I love this movie. I love Hugh Jackman. I love Wolverine. I'm going to give Logan 5 stars. It's one of my favorite movies of all time. I can't quantify into words how much I love this movie. And, you know, now we're finally getting Hugh Jackman back playing as the character of Wolverine. And we obviously don't know what'll happen. This video is being created before the new movie comes out with him reprising the role. But I just would also love to say here, regardless of what happens in the next few movies, if there's more than one, I would love nothing more than to, in person, thank Hugh Jackman. Thank you for the role. Thank you for the passion. Thank you for being this character, because it meant so much to me growing up and my fandom of not just X-Men, but like movies in general, really. My favorite movie of all time, and it's really hard to say that because there are some times where you look at certain things and you go, I don't know if that's my favorite movie. It's kind of arbitrary thing to say what your favorite movie is because there's so many different ones. Nah, man, this is my favorite movie. It means way too much to me to not be my favorite movie. Okay, that's gonna wrap it up here. Sorry for being such a weird fucking, annoying, emotional fucking wreck of a dude talking about a stupid comic book movie, man. Regardless, thank you so much for watching. If you liked what you see, hit subscribe. Also, be sure to check down all the links down below for all my other content for Twitter and TikTok and all the other things that I like to do. Be on the lookout for the next review, which is going to be a twofer yet again, where we're going to combine Deadpool 1 and 2 in the lead up to the next film. Thank you so much for watching. Take it easy, guys, and I will talk to you all next time.